Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories of everyday people and their families. I endeavour to continue publishing episodes ad-free. In order to do so, I would love your support by reviewing my podcast or consider becoming a subscriber for only the cost of a coffee a month. This gives you early access to episodes and also access to bonus episodes, of which at this stage there's over 30. Episode 184, Robert Barr-Smith. Robert Barr-Smith left an estate worth nearly £1.8 million when he died in Adelaide in November 1915. He was a well-known philanthropist. His estate was the largest in South Australia until then, and of the estate more than £40,000 was left to charities. Robert was born on the 4th of February 1824 at Lochwinnock, Renfrewshire, Scotland, to Reverend Dr. Smith of the Free Church of Scotland and his wife Marjorie Barr. The Reverend Smith was a popular preacher and a man of high principles and determination, and he took pains to see that the religious and secular training of his son was of most thorough character. After the split with the established church in 1843, he resigned his post to establish a new free church and forfeited a comfortable living. The family, that by this stage had 11 children, were reduced almost to destitution. Robert was a studious and high-minded scholar. He enrolled at the University of Glasgow at the age of 14 and in 1842 found work as a clerk in Glasgow, showing an aptitude for business. He then started his own commission business as R.B. Smith and Company as a commission agent and trader in corn. His characteristics in youth and throughout his life were thoroughness and enthusiasm. His statement, "Whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with all thy might," and no opportunity of acquiring knowledge was wasted. Right through his career, it was his determination to make the best of his surroundings, and to this fact is due the success which always crowned his efforts. He wasn't born with the proverbial silver spoon in his mouth, but he possessed advantages denied to many of his companions, and he always made the most of them. Robert never gave up the habits of frugality and accounted for all expenses as an adult. Few of the pioneers of South Australia came to the task as he did, with a liberal education and a reasonable supply of money in his purse, but on the other hand, none of them turned to better purpose than he did with the openings that presented themselves. It was through the influence of his brother-in-law, Sir Thomas Elder, that Mr. Barr-Smith turned his back on the old home. Mr. George Elder, being about to relinquish his connection with the firm of Elder and Company, established by the four sons of a prosperous ship owner, Captain George Elder, of Kirkcaldy, Scotland. An invitation was sent to Robert to take his place, so as a young man of 30, in 1854 he came to Adelaide, passing through Melbourne on his way. Constitutional government had not been established in South Australia when he first became associated with the firm. Robert had known the Elder family in Scotland, and he wrote from Melbourne to ask Joanna Elder for her hand in marriage. She did not consent at that time as she was very young, but 2 years later, at the age of 21, she travelled in the care of the ship's captain to Melbourne, where Robert and Joanna were married in 1856 before transferring to Adelaide. Therefore, Robert and his business partner, Thomas Elder, became brothers-in-law. And the announcement of the marriage on the 15th of April at the residence of William M. Bell, Esquire, South Yarra, Melbourne, by the Reverend Dr. Cairns, Robert Barr-Smith, Esquire, Merchant, Adelaide, to Joanna Lang, youngest daughter of George Elder, Esquire, Kirkcaldy, Scotland. Robert and Johanna's first home in South Australia was at Myrtlebank, an 8-room bluestone house built by William Sanders, which had been rented in succession by Joanna's brothers, William, George and Thomas Elder. Then the Barr-Smiths moved next door to William Elder's property, Ridge Park, after he returned to Scotland, but they had to move out when the house was sold to William Ferguson. Ridge Park subsequently became the intermediary for the importation of Elder and Barr-Smith horses. Myrtlebank today forms part of the War Veterans Home and is now part of the Ridge Park Healthcare Centre for Aged Care. Fayette Goss reflected on how hard the transition must have been for the new young bride. The crude, isolated town, created little more than 20 years earlier out of bush wilderness, with its brand new buildings, its lack of establishment and facilities, its strange landscapes and daunting gum trees, its summer heat and wildness and loneliness, was a far cry from the bracing, confining domestic life in Kirkcaldy. The Elder Company pioneered the opening of outback South Australia. It fenced properties and sunk bores for water. In 1858, the name of the business was altered on the admission of Mr. Edward Sterling and Mr. John Taylor as partners, and it went under the title of Elder, Sterling and Company. In that year, however, the two gentlemen that recently added to the business retired, and for the first time in its history, it became known by the name, which it still bears, Elder Smith and Company. In 1859, Elder Smith and Company financed the Wallaroo and Moonta copper mines, which, after some initial losses, brought large returns to the partners of the company. The company also had interests in the Adelaide Steam Tug and Adelaide Steamship Companies. By 1860, Robert and Joanna rented Oaklands, a fine two-storey house in Marion built by Samuel Kern and set in 500 acres of farmland. The rich soil produced abundant crops of lucerne, oranges and grapes, from which some 500 gallons of wine was produced in 1862. Kern's absentee sons inherited the property following his death in 1857. Oaklands has long since been demolished. In 1861, Robert and Johanna were living in Paddington, London, where he was working as a merchant, and after returning, the Barr-Smiths with their family of two young children rented St Clair at Woodville, a fine mansion built by S.R. Clark, which had been expanded to some 30 rooms with a large ballroom. He also added a second story and an underground kitchen. They remained at St Clair for 8 years, in which Mabel, Tom, Jean, Joanna and Erlestoon were born. Despite disliking the disruption of building, Robert added another bedroom and dining room during their tenure. Robert complained to George Elder that just returning from a miserable February at Glenelg to a half-finished house at Woodville. It's not easy to say by what we suffer most, but the change at least has the advantage of a drift in a kind of misery. The St Clair homestead was compulsory acquired by the local council and demolished to make way for the St Clair Recreation Centre, which opened in 1962. The St Clair name survives as a local park and a new suburban development. In 1863, Robert Barr-Smith and Thomas Elder became the sole partners in Elder Smith and Company, now known as Elders Limited, with Thomas Elder being the visionary and Robert Barr-Smith the business genius. Thomas Elder bought Birksgate at Glen Osmond from the pastoralist and barrister Arthur Hardy in 1864. He immediately enlarged the house, added another story, a gas plant for heating and a massive conservatory shipped out from Scotland in which he grew bananas and orchids. The grounds also included an artificial lake, an 11-acre vineyard, paddocks for racehorses, a private zoo, and a tower from which he could signal his yachts in the Gulf and watch for overseas ships. On their arrival, he would discharge his cannon and run up the Union Jack. In 1869, he embarked on an extended trip to England and Scotland and offered his home to his sister and her family. They remained there for 2 years until Thomas's return. Thomas Elder bequeathed Birksgate to Thomas Elder Barr-Smith, and it remained in the family until rezoning from a rural to urban zone forced its sale. The house was demolished to make way for a housing estate in 1972. The conservatory was relocated to Beechwood, the next home of Tom Barr-Smith, in 1969. It was not until 1870 that Robert and Joanna began to use both of his middle names and surnames as a hyphen surname. After leaving Birksgate, Robert and Joanna rented the Briars in Medindi from George C. Hawker of Bungaree Station for 4 years. During this time, 2 more children, Hugh and Ida, died while young, and Joanna gave birth to another son they named Robert, the first Robert having died some 10 years before. Early in 1873, the family was again on the move and travelled to England. While in England, Robert negotiated to buy the Briars with plans to enlarge the house, but he suddenly purchased Torrens Park instead. George Hawker lived in the house until he died, Joanna Barr-Smith having married his second son, George Charles Hawker. The Briars still stands as a private home, having been converted for a time to serve as the McBride Maternity Hospital. While in England, Robert was feeling the lack of a family home. Robert wrote to Thomas Elder, "We have so much of our lives without a fixed home, but I must put my foot down now, somewhere. The lack of it to a large family is intolerable. In the meantime, we deeply regret leaving South Australia and are by no means fascinated by the life we observe. We have been living until last week in hotels, and this is not a pleasant kind of life. It may be judging hastily, but so far we do not think we have gained anything by leaving South Australia. 20 years is a long part of one's life. Friendships are formed and interests created which do not die out at once. To tumble yourself into the midst of strangers who do not care a brass farthing for you, to subject yourself to live in a disagreeable climate where it is always raining, is doubtful wisdom. A fixed home is a necessity." So Torrens Park, which was built by Sir Robert Torrens in 1853, And then, much enlarged by Walter Watson Hughes, Robert's partner in the Moonta mines, he decided to remain in England, and they bought the house complete with the furnishings on their return in 1874 and immediately moved in. In 1879, the family again travelled to England. By the time they returned in 1880, the enlargements to Torrance Park were completed, including more bedrooms, a larger drawing room and a new billiard room. The teenage children were forever dressing up and devising plays. During their trip to London in 1883 and 1884, Robert indulged them by planning a little private theatre to be entered through the greenhouses. It was a big project, a complete theatre with stage machinery, dressing rooms, set and costumes, and an auditorium 20 metres by 10 to accommodate 200 people, all planned by Robert with no architect. With their own theatre in mind, Mabel, Jean and Joe took drama lessons in London with the former Shakespearean actress Isabella Dallas. Mabel was now 23 and was always the keenest performer and pleased to recite when asked. The theatre opened in December 1885 with scenes from Romeo and Juliet and a 2-act comedy, Checkmate, presented by Tom, now back from Cambridge, the daughters and their friends. One of the leads was called back to his regiment, and his place was taken by a young professor from the university and a future Nobel Prize winner, William Bragg. Following the purchase of Torrance Park, Robert bought an old coaching inn at Mount Barker in the Adelaide Hills. Auchindarroch, they commissioned a young architect, John Granger, to convert it into a cool retreat for hot summer months. A 30-roomed house of similar magnitude to Torrance Park, but more Georgian in appearance, but also decorated throughout with William Morris furnishings. The 42-acre grounds included 3 acres of formal gardens and 3 acres of orchards. They became part of the social life at Mount Barker, entertaining friends and neighbours and even organising a theatrical program in the local hall. Robert drove his horse and buggy 22 miles into his office in the morning, changing horses at Eagle on the Hill, and returned about 5 o'clock, but it was often more convenient for him to stay in town, sometimes with Sir Thomas Elder. In 1883 to 1885, Robert was 60 and Joanna 49, and the Barr-Smiths undertook their 3rd trip to Britain in 10 years. For the next 18 months, they made do in hotels and rented apartments. Robert, with his particular attention to detail, sent hundreds of letters containing detailed instructions back to South Australia regarding colours of paint, hanging of wallpaper and mirrors, plans for bookcases and mantelpieces, and the lighting and the flooring for the theatre, as well as plans for the garden. Robert and Joanna also enjoyed their lovely new houses, including which Johanna hosted numerous entertainments, balls, polo matches, suppers and dinners. The lavish social functions were often associated by concerts, recitations, plays, and accompanied by sumptuous suppers and dinners. At times, the chairs were removed so dancing could take place on the sprung floor. This rare private theatre has now been restored and is used by Scotch College. Mr. Barr-Smith and his charming wife were the soul of considerate hospitality that was lavished upon a bounteous but discriminative hand. When their 3 sons and 4 daughters were all at home at Torrance Park, it was a centre of merriment and gladness. The house was equipped with the theatre and surrounded by lawns and orchards and gardens. It was an ideal place for happy gatherings there. Christmas was a time of special joy, and Robert and Joanna were great shoppers. They swiftly amassed a great pile of chatels in Europe to bring back with them. They never travelled light. They brought lavishly mosaics from Florence, glass from Prague, 320 square metres of parquet from Switzerland, a case of pictures from Rome, another case of pictures from Munich, 2 cases of picture frames from Florence, and an assortment of Dresden china, lamps, a case of material for making ice, cases of wine, and a box of toys. Back in England, Robert ordered brasses for his carriages from Birmingham and greenhouses from Brompton. Torrance Park stood in the foothills, surrounded by bushland and forest, with panoramic views over St Vincent's Gulf. Its beautiful Gothic style of pale local stone had a tower and narrow arched windows. At Auchindarroch in Mount Barker, the same warm-hearted personality was in vogue during the summer. Townspeople and friends travelled from a distance to participate in garden parties, and there was scarcely a person in the locality who did not share in the entertainment. Torrance Park was offered by Robert and Johanna for the use of a military hospital during World War I, and some land was sold for building blocks. Following Robert and Johanna's death, the family disposed of their houses, and 34 acres of Torrance Park became Scotch College. In 1919, Auchindarroch was sold at auction, ending almost 41 years of family ownership. In 1922, the Memorial Hospital purchased it as a rest and convalescent home, during which it became sadly neglected. In World War II, it served as a Red Cross rest home and then an RAAF hospital. In the early 1970s, it became a cooperative family homes venture and underwent considerable restoration before being sold to the state and suffering further neglect under the administration of the State Planning Authority. In the year 2000, the Wallace family purchased the property for conversion to an entertainment complex, including cinemas, and they've restored many of the rooms to their former glory. Robert and Johanna's marriage was long and happy. It was Robert's custom, when he was at home, to pick a posy for Johanna from the garden and present it to her at breakfast. Johanna greatly missed Robert on his frequent journeys and would become anxious about his health and the well-being of the family. They wrote to each other every day if possible, and Robert would often gently tease Johanna about her devotion. In 1895, Johanna responded, "Dear, dear, dearest and best of Bobs, you cannot believe that I can think of others as better or purer men, kinder or more generous husbands. Darling, darling, dearest love of my heart, I adore you, I esteem you, I am so much wrapped up in you that my heart is sore with so much love." Robert was just as devoted to his wife, writing to his son in later life, "But the truth is, I am getting so old, I do not like to be separated from your mother at our time of life." Johanna was by all accounts an intelligent and witty woman who took a deep interest in political, social and industrial events. Her friends and her husband relied on her judgment in important matters, and in social matters she was energetic and thoughtful. She was friendly with people from all levels, even with Hallam Lord Tennyson and his wife Lady Audrey, despite her reservations about royalty, describing herself as having socialist leanings. She was also very kind and would dispense gifts and money to the poor and distressed. When she and her daughters attended Church of England services, Johanna also assisted her Catholic friend Mary MacKillop financially with the establishment of the Josephite convent at Mitcham and in her home for unwed mothers and women in distress. She loved Scotland and the country life and appreciated simple pleasures, and yet was prepared to make the difficult journey back to England with Robert and the children 6 times. She was adored by her children and her grandchildren. In Charles's memorial in the newspaper, it was mentioned of Johanna, "Mrs. Barr-Smith too has been most generous to every good cause which has come under her notice, and no one who has lived in the vicinity of her city home at Torrens Park, Mitcham, or the handsome country mansion Auchendurrock in Mount Barker, can have failed to appreciate the loving tenderness with which her name is mentioned by those who have either been recipients of her bounty or who have knowledge of her considerate kindness. She is looked upon, more particularly by the young folk, as the good fairy of the district, and indeed it is questionable whether that designation was ever more richly deserved. Husband and wife have striven to make those around them happy, and they've achieved a large amount of success in that very laudable endeavour." In 1888, Elders Smith and Company was amalgamated with its subsidiary Elders Wool and Produce Company Limited. Barr-Smith was a major shareholder in the Elders Trustee and Executor Company, a spin-off of the original firm, which was founded in 1910 and formed Elders Metal and Mercantile in Melbourne. Elders' profits more than doubled from 1918 to 1928, with Tom Elder Barr-Smith, Robert and Johanna's son, being chairman. And that was the beginning of Elders as we know it today. Robert was also a director of Beltana, Mootaroo and Moomba Pastoral Companies, the Wallaroo and Moonta Mining and Smelting Company, the Adelaide Steamship Company, the South Australian Gas Company, the Mercantile Marine and Fire Insurance Company of South Australia, the Australian Mutual Provident Society, the English, Scottish and Australian Bank, the Mortgage Company of South Australia and the South Australian Company. As a sideline, he also helped found the Bank of Adelaide. Mr. Barr-Smith, like his senior partner and his predecessors in the business, manifested a deep interest into the welfare of the state, and in the promise of securing promising investments for their capital, he did much to assist in the development of its resources. Particularly was this the case in the respect to the pastoral and mineral interests of South Australia, although in many other directions the influence of his money and his energetic personality have been felt. It would be hard to name any other enterprise on a large scale which has been established by combined effort in which Mr. Barr-Smith has not held a hand. The number of companies in which he holds shares is immense, and he acted as a director in respect to many of the most successful financial institutions of the metropolis. Many a struggling pastoralist has also been helped by the judicious advice and the substantial backing of Mr. Barr-Smith, and indeed the kindly acts he did both in the way of business and in his private capacity were endless. He had an immense estate of his own to manage, in addition to the far-reaching interests associated with the operations of the firm, of which during the closing years of his partner's life and before it was transferred to the board of directors, he was sole manager. He had a very large amount of property in South Australia and also owned sheep and cattle runs in Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland. In 1899 they made their last but not very joyful trip to England. Robert was suffering from bronchitis and wished to leave the miserable climate behind, but Joanna loved the Scottish weather and landscape. All of the children were independent now, and for some time Robert and Joanna had been thinking of moving into something smaller and more modern. Johanna declared she hated Torrens Park and in 1901 rented a house, Eothen, in East Terrace in the city. Joanna had a fear of earthquakes, and the following two earthquakes in 1902, which caused cracks in Torrens Park, she refused to remain there. So in 1905 they moved into what they termed a cottage, which consisted of several reception rooms, 3 main bedrooms, 4 servants' rooms and a servants' hall, plus cellars and stables. The grand entertainment ceased and Robert and Johanna lived quietly, although they still spent their hot summers at Mount Barker. This home subsequently became a convent and was later demolished. Robert Barr-Smith refused a knighthood, saying, "I have done nothing to earn it, and the acceptance of it would be inconsistent with the spirit of my whole life." Robert died on the 20th of November 1915 in Adelaide at the age of 91. He was a shrewd and enterprising man of affairs, and his guidance was always a guarantee of success. He not only filled his own pockets, but helped to fill those of other people. He was considerate, generous, wise, and far-seeing. He always had a high sense of duty. No whisper of a dishonourable transaction was ever associated with his name. He retained his faculties to the last, and his advice was eagerly sought when he was in all but mental strength an old man. His heart was as big as his brain, and out of the stores of his wealth he was always more than ready to help institutions and individuals and causes which were in need. No one ever went to him with a genuine story of distress that came away empty-handed, and often his gifts were spontaneous and unexpected. Little went on in the city or the state of South Australia of important character with which he was not acquainted, and his benefactions were of a response to the results of his judgment. He was never too busy to make inquiries concerning the recipients of his bounty. Every moment of his time was put into good account, but he was never too busy to be courteous, never too absorbed in his work to be kind. The name of Mr. Barr-Smith will always be an inspiration. He fought a good fight and has finished his course, and his reputation and example will be a precious possession to the people of South Australia. And another obituary that reads, "The private liberality of Mr. Barr-Smith, showing his ordinary subscriptions every year, must have amounted to quite a princely sum, but in addition to these he gave largely to special objects. The begging letters he received every morning were practically numberless, but he dealt with them all in a wise and systematic way. His spontaneous gifts were large, and many will never be known. His public donations reached big figures. The Adelaide University Library was subsidised by him to the extent of £3,000 at various times, in addition to the £10,000 given towards the scheme for the erection of residential colleges. He made valuable gifts of pictures to the art gallery, and it was through his open-handedness that Mr. Clement Wragg was able to erect an observatory at the summit of Mount Kosciuszko. He purchased the steam lifeboat City of Adelaide at a cost of £3,500 and presented it to the government for service on the southeastern coast. He donated several sums to a prize fund of the School of the Mines, and in 1899 he sent £200 towards the erection of a home for deaf mutes at Parafield. A year afterwards he subscribed liberally towards the purchase of horses for the first contingent to be sent to South Africa, and in 1901 he surprised and gratified the Bishop of Adelaide by forwarding him a cheque of £10,000 towards the cost of completing St. Peter's Cathedral, which had previously been the object of many thoughtful gifts from the same source. He was the founder of the Cremation Society, to whose funds he subscribed most liberally. He was a strong advocate of cremation as a method of disposing the bodies of the dead, and he long ago expressed his desire to be cremated when he passed away. Of more recent dates, one may recall many acts of public generosity on the part of the deceased philanthropist. For instance, it was he, when the first appeal was made for a motor ambulance for the front, who came forward with his characteristic spontaneity and offered 2 ambulances. Again, it was he who, when the authorities were seeking suitable buildings for military hospitals, immediately offered his beautiful property at Torrens Park. When the project for the establishment of the Diocese of Wallachra was mooted, he gave £2,000 to its fund. Mr. Barr-Smith, whose liberality knew no distinctions of creed or politics, some years ago gave a cheque of £2,300 to the trustee of the Trades Hall to pay the debt of that institution. Mr. Barr-Smith seldom appeared on a public platform and scarcely ever presided at a meeting larger than one of the many directorates of which he was chairman. He disliked ostentation of all kinds and neither indulged in flattery nor put himself in the way of receiving it. Several times during the last decade or two, Mr. Barr-Smith made journeys to Great Britain, but he always looked on Adelaide as his home, and he made no secret of his belief that it was the prettiest and most cosy city in the empire. For a time, Mr. Barr-Smith was a member of the Botanical Gardens Board and interested himself in the beautiful reserve. The fountain that stands near the Palm House was erected by him at a cost of £170. Mr. Barr-Smith was well known to the followers of the turf. He early evinced a great love for good horseflesh, and he had both bred and raced animals with irreproachable pedigrees. The news of the death of Robert Barr-Smith at his residence in Angus Street came as a shock and was a source of grief to the whole community. Although he had reached a patriarchal age, he'd always been so hale and hearty that there was a generous hope that he would continue his useful life for many years and would attain to the dignity of a centenarian. There are few residents of the city who can remember the time when in the realms of high finance the name Mr. Barr-Smith was not one to conjure with. He leaves one son, Mr. T.E. Barr-Smith, and three daughters, Mrs. F.W. Braund of England, Mrs. G.C. Hawker Jr. and Mrs. T. O'Halloran Giles. He lost 5 sons and 4 daughters, some of the children dying in infancy and others later in life. Mr. Barr-Smith's remains were removed from his residence in Angus Street for cremation at West Terrace. Mr. T.E. Barr-Smith carried the urn containing the ashes of his father to the family vault, and here, beneath the eyes of many sorrowing spectators, the funeral vessel was placed beside the urns containing the ashes of his 2 deceased children. Following the death of Robert Barr-Smith in 1915, his family gave a permanent endowment to the University of Adelaide Library, and in 1927, Robert's son Tom offered £20,000 for the construction of a separate library building to be dedicated in the name of his father. Eventually, more than £30,000 was given for the building that opened in March 1932. Robert and Johanna had a love of books. They bought books in 6s and in dozens for the joy of giving them where they would be appreciated. Robert was a member of the Adelaide Book Society in 1869, a private circulating library that was founded in 1884, limited to 24 members. In 1888, the library was described as a rich repast suited to every taste, and there was a keen competition for vacancies. Johanna died 4 years later on the 23rd of October 1919, and it says the late Mrs. R. Barr-Smith. Death of a noble woman. Twain, they say, the Scots of a peculiar felicitous union, and the words apply with full force to the late Mr. Robert Barr-Smith and his widow, Mrs. Johanna Barr-Smith, who died in her 85th year. For some time before his demise, Mr. R. Barr-Smith was devoutly attended to by his wife. She was a sister of the late Sir Thomas Elder, and it was said of her that she emulated him in the possession of a keen brain and generous heart. The deceased lady had a favourite residence at Auchendarroch, Mount Barker, and another at Torrens Park. Mr. and Mrs. Barr-Smith also resided at Angus Street, and that is where the widow died. In the palmy days of the Mount Barker home, Auchendarroch was noted for the hospitality which prevailed there. Christmas was an ever festive occasion. Mrs. Barr-Smith also supported relief movements. Robert and Johanna had 13 children over 22 years, from 1857 to 1879, but not all lived into adulthood. 6 died as children. Robert, aged 6, Neil at the age of 3 weeks, Hugh just before he turned 2, Ida at 4 years of age, Ursula at 2, and Dorothea, who was born in Edinburgh but died in Australia at 2 years of age. Robert and Johanna's grief at the deaths of their children was profound. Robert wrote, "I am sorry to tell you, my mind and attentions have been distracted by the loss of our very little dear daughter Ida of 4 years. She died on the 26th of November. It is strange how one shrivels into one's own concerns, strange and pitiable." And another letter, "The event of the month for us was a sad one. Our little daughter Ursula died of croup on the 13th after a few hours' illness. The pet of all she was, and the amount of love we all lavished on her is impossible to describe." Joanna often became ill with grief, suffering from headaches and fretted with despondency. She never forgot her lost children, and when in Adelaide, she and Robert would place flowers on their graves every Sunday. Molly Lego relates how one day she crept up to her grandmother's bedroom in Auchendarrick to discover photographs on the bedroom wall of the 6 deceased children covered with white curtains. So the remaining surviving children. The first, George Elder Barr-Smith, was born on the 10th of October 1858 at Glen Osmond, South Australia. He was an epileptic and had an intellectual disability. When at 18 his fits and rages became too difficult for his parents to manage, Robert arranged for him to be boarded in Victoria with a retired Scot clergyman named John Gardner and his wife and a personal servant, before buying him a house in Victor Harbour and setting him up in his own comfortable household with dogs and horses, a keeper and 3 servants. Robert and Johanna regularly wrote to George and visited him, often on his birthday, and in 1894 they celebrated his birthday at Victor Harbour with a ball for 100 people. George lived to be 56 and enjoyed an energetic and full life before dying in January 1914 at Somerton, South Australia, a year before Robert. The Barr-Smith daughters inherited their parents' high principles, common sense, a dislike of pretension and a high sense of fun. They were brought up in privileged homes and indulged in drama lessons and had their private theatre at Torrens Park where they could stage pageants and plays. Mabel and her sister Jo were described as sunny and vivacious. Mabel Fairfax Barr-Smith was born on the 13th of December 1861 at Woodville in South Australia. She was a skilled horsewoman and the keenest at theatricals. On the 15th of April 1896, Mabel married her fellow hunter and actor Fred Braund of George Wills and Company at Walkerville, South Australia. Fred was relocated to the London office, so the couple spent the rest of their lives in England, leaving South Australia just after their marriage. Mabel died on the 17th of October 1946 at Luton, Bedfordshire, England, aged 84, and they had no children. Tom Elder Barr-Smith was born on the 8th of December 1863 at Woodville, South Australia. He was, in character, much like his father, honest, compassionate and business-minded. Robert concerned himself greatly with Tom's education to ensure that he gained admission into Cambridge. Tom studied law and ultimately gained an MA from Trinity College, and he returned to Adelaide in 1885 and married Mary Isabel Mitchell, known as Molly, from Ayrshire, Scotland, and they raised 4 daughters and 2 sons. Tom devoted the rest of his life to the family firm and in turn became one of South Australia's great philanthropists. Tom's interests included competing in car rallies. A steam locomotive, now preserved in the National Railway Museum in Port Adelaide, was named after him in 1926, and there's a plaque in his honour on the Jubilee 150 walkway. Tom died on the 26th of November 1941 at the age of 77. Jane Belfour St Clair Barr-Smith, known as Jean, who was born on the 20th of December 1864 at Woodville, South Australia. She was a shy, sentimental and often awkward lady, but was a devoted and unselfish daughter. For a time she was courted by Charles Edward Todd, the son of astronomer and postmaster Sir Charles Todd, but Robert and Johanna were not in favour of the match. Eventually, after some strong talking from Johanna, she happily married Tom O'Halloran Giles, an Adelaide lawyer and grandson of the pioneer Thomas Giles, at St Andrew's Church at Walkerville on the 4th of October 1888 when Jean was 23. They had 4 children. Their only daughter was an artist who'd moved to London. One son, Robert, died in World War I in Belgium, and in later days it was Jean who had at times puzzled and frustrated her mother by her silence and moods, but who became Johanna's greatest companion. Jean died on the 1st of June 1961 in North Adelaide, aged 96. Johanna Fitzgerald Barr-Smith, known as Jo by the family, was born on the 3rd of February 1866 at Woodville, South Australia. She was a dear, kind and loving daughter, and she married George Charles Hawker of Bungaree Station at Walkerville on the 13th of July 1886, when she was 20 and George 35. George tragically died from septicemia following a yachting accident at Port Elliot, leaving Jo with a 2-year-old daughter and a 4-week-old boy. Later, on a voyage to England to visit Mabel, Jo met Thomas George Akers, a Canadian who was working as an official on the Indian Railways and had boarded the ship in India. Johanna and Robert were unimpressed, calling him a pleasant Anglo-Indian pauper. But Jo returned to London and they married in December 1899, and she went with him to live in India. Their marriage was not successful and they divorced in 1915. Jo changed her name back to Hawker but stayed in England with her children, and she died on the 19th of September 1963 in England at the age of 97. Marjorie Erlestoon Barr-Smith, known as Erlestoon to the family, was born on the 11th of January 1868 at Woodville, South Australia. Erlestoon proved to be the most problematic of the children. Johanna especially found her moody, willful and argumentative. She loved music but was troubled by increased deafness. Joanna took her daughter to Germany when she was 21, hoping to encourage her to study music and German, only to discover that nothing could be done about her hearing and that she would soon become deaf. On their return to England, Erlestoon appeared to have suffered a breakdown, followed by some mysterious dishonourable behaviour that enraged and shamed her parents. She returned to Australia and in 1898, at the age of 30, married the Adelaide University Professor of Philosophy and English Literature, William Mitchell, and had 2 children with him. Erlestoon died in her mid-40s on the 3rd of August 1913 in Fitzroy, Victoria, from tuberculosis, when her children were 15 and 13. Robert Barr-Smith, known as Bertie, was born on the 27th of November 1872 in Adelaide. Their third son was a matter of some anxiety to Robert and Johanna. Although adored by both, he was good at sports but not a good student. Despite Robert's fear of private schools and their influence, they agreed that he should accompany their friend Frank Adams to Oxford in England for schooling. Robert wrote to his sister Jessie, "I have parted with my boy with great sorrow, not knowing if I shall ever see him again. He is a most lovable boy, bright and pleasant in all his ways, a little too easily led and quite capable of going wrong if he falls into bad hands. I hope there is no danger of this. I have sent him away because I thought it would give him the best chance of growing up a worthy young fellow. Whatever the consequence, I have acted not from choice, but from principle, God knows." Bertie returned to Adelaide and lived in the family home, but also worked at various stations at his father's bidding and escaped to Africa to go game hunting. He was an excellent rider and enthusiastic about motor racing and record breaking, but did not marry. He died on the last day of 1909 after falling down the stairs at Auchendoric. According to the book A Family Affair, he drank himself into an early grave at the age of only 37. Robert was devoted to all of his children. Johanna wrote to him, "You give your offspring a terrible slanging in your today's letter. I could not help laughing as I read your letter, for there's not a softer, kinder-hearted old daddy longlegs in this world than you are, and you were just playing at calling your children by bad names. Certainly they have occasionally given us sad trouble with their waywardness and their donkeyishness, but take them by and by, dear Bob. They are a very good lot, and you and I would feel pretty lost without them." Robert and Johanna were indulgent and loving grandparents. Johanna entertained them with parties and dress-ups in the theatre at Torrens Park. Robert's granddaughter Molly recounts in the book A Family Affair that she was very fond of her grandfather and would visit Robert each morning in his study and then walk through the garden to see Thibel, the Swedish gardener. Robert would compose verses and plays for his grandsons on his typewriter, and in his old age Robert had leisure to indulge himself with the children and give attention for which he had not had time with his own sons when they were young. So I hope you enjoyed the story of Robert Barr-Smith, certainly a man that did very, very well for himself in the fledgling state of South Australia. If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch.